I'm sure we'll get a few people trickling in as we get started. But let's start off. Let me first of all welcome you all to this session this afternoon, which is titled Beyond the Leap of Faith, Evaluative Reflections on the Practices of Monitoring and Evaluating Inter-Religious Peacebuilding. So we've got a great panel this afternoon, and we're going to be hearing from Peter Woodrow, who's on my left here. Peter, I'm sure you all know, Executive Director of CDA, and
until today.
Until today, okay. Well, we should congratulate him for
how
all
you're
his
spending
work
your
and
retirement.
thank him for all the efforts he's made to peacebuilding over the years. I'm not going to go into the detailed bios of everybody here, but just to sort of pull out a few highlights. I mean, Peter is probably best known as being co-director of the Reflected Peacebuilding Practice Program, and for his many publications that have made real substantive contributions to thinking and practice in peacebuilding, around systems thinking and its relevance to peacebuilding, theories of change. He and I worked on a piece a while back on that. And then, looking forward to his most recent publication, Adding Up to Peace, Using Systems Thinking for Collective Impact, which is to be published in December. So we're looking forward to that. We'll also hear from James Patton, who's President and CEO of International Centre for Religion and Diplomacy. He's sat there in the middle. And James has had over 20 years of experience in peacebuilding, having worked in Latin America, Asia and Africa. And he sits on two interesting groups, very relevant to this particular topic today. Firstly, the US State Department's Working Group on Religion and Foreign Policy, and then he's been a member also of the Public-Private Partnership that's been advancing peace and reconciliation in Colombia, an organisation called Reconciliación Colombia. We'll also hear from Nell Bolton, who's had many years' experience working for CRS on peacebuilding, governance and justice. Her current role there is as Senior Technical Advisor, Justice and Peacebuilding. And she's worked since 2005 on these issues in Africa, Middle East and Asia. And then lastly, we have Jennifer Kuiper here, sat on my immediate right. Jennifer is an independent consultant, currently working for Democracy International, and she's leading a team for the USAID CMM Peace Task 1 evaluation, which we'll hear about more later. A very relevant piece of work. And Jennifer has had 15 years of experience working on designing and evaluating peacebuilding programs both here in the US and also internationally. So we've got a very experienced and qualified group to talk to this theme this afternoon. And what we're going to be doing, the purpose of this session really was to create a space where we could reflect on the state of play, on what we know about the effectiveness of interreligious action for peacebuilding, to reflect on particularly the monitoring and evaluation of these programs. What are some of the challenges, what are we learning? And we're going to be doing that by, first of all, hearing from Peter about the experience of producing a guide which has been supported by the GHR Foundation as part of a project that's been going on for 3 years now. We have Mary Dalsin in the audience here, who's from GHR, so many thanks to Mary and Andreas for supporting this work. And so Peter's going to be talking about that process of developing the guide and what's actually in the guide. You've got a flyer here for that particular document, one of the deliverables on the program, and you can access the full guide online. Secondly, we're going to be hearing from James on some of the methodological challenges of undertaking rigorous monitoring evaluation of interreligious action for peacebuilding programming. And then we're going to be hearing, I think, one case study now, isn't it, from Kenya? We've limited ourselves in terms of just 7 minutes to make presentations because we wanted to create space for a conversation, a real exchange and discussion, and also to hear some of your experience as well. So Nell will talk about the case study they just had evaluated of work on interreligious practice in Kenya. And then lastly, we'll hear from Jennifer on a really interesting project that's going on at the moment. It's USAID's CMM's evaluation of interreligious dimensions of peacebuilding projects in 4 programs, 2 in Central African Republic and 2 in southern Thailand. So Jennifer's going to be sharing with us some of the reflections on the work they've done. They've done a baseline study so far and not fully completed that piece of work yet, but at least where they are currently, some of the sort of issues emerging from that. Before we get to the other panelists, I just wanted to make a few introductory remarks just to set the scene and the context. And firstly to say something about the Interreligious Action for Peacebuilding project. This is a 3-year project that the Alliance for Peacebuilding has been leading in partnership with CDA Collaborative Learning and Search for Common Ground. And the broad purpose, these are the specific objectives, but the broad purpose of this was really to draw attention to this area of work and to highlight its importance, to establish the state of play in terms of what was known about the evaluations, about the effectiveness of this kind of strand of work within our field, and then also to convene secular and faith-based groups to work together to develop some guidance on how to strengthen approaches to design, monitor and evaluate these programs. So that's broadly the purpose of the project. And I want to go on then and just say a little bit about why, Interreligious Action for Peacebuilding. Why did Alliance for Peacebuilding, together with its partners, focus on this particular issue? And I think we all know the importance that religious identity and religious differences can play in fanning the flames of violence, of inciting violence, sustaining violence. We can all think of many examples where religion and religious identity has played a part, whether it's Central African Republic or Israel-Palestine conflict, or in the Plateau State in Nigeria, or in the 969 movement in Myanmar. But having said that, we also know that religion is actually not always the driver of these conflicts, and in fact that there are many other issues that are the main drivers on which religious identity is overlain. And these issues are often to do with conflict over power, conflict over access to natural resources, long-standing grievances to do with geographical, community conflicts and so on. And what we hear relatively little about, or less about, is really the power of involving religious leaders, religious institutions and religious communities in peace building. Their role can often be pivotal to achieving peace, and we've seen that take place in, for instance, war-torn Sierra Leone, and also in religious groups advocating for peace post-apartheid in South Africa. So there's a lot of reasons why we should be paying attention to this area of work. I want to just suggest a definition, because again, similar to Julia yesterday talking about narratives of peace building, you may well all have your own takes on what this means and what are we talking about when we talk about interreligious action for peace building. And the definition that we settled on in the Effective Interreligious Action for Peace Building project was as follows: that it's essentially work that involves peace building initiatives that involve actors, institutions and interventions from multiple religions that focus on religious narratives, target religious dimensions of a conflict, or promote peace between religious groups, or represent the efforts of religious groups to influence secular or political actors. Actions may take place at any level or scale in support of solidarity, cooperation, prevention of conflict, or conflict resolution. So that was our definition, a lot of dimensions to it, a lot of different aspects to it, but that was essentially our attempt to define what we mean by interreligious action for peace building. And I think there's been a growing realization over the past 5, 6, 7 years of the importance of this area of work. You can look at the creation of the State Department's Religious Foreign Policy Working Group and the setting up in USIP of their Center for Religion and Peace Building, and also the Office of Religious Engagement more recently, around 2013. And then this recent piece of work, again, USA and CMM's commitment to trying to identify what the potential contribution that this area of work could make to development and peace building work. But from the work that we've done over the last 3 years under the Effective Interreligious Action for Peacebuilding Program, which involved a meta-evaluation of 7 evaluations in this area and a broader literature review, one thing we found out is that really the potential for this area of work is not being realized. We're kind of falling short. There's a measurement gap. We haven't got the evidence for the effectiveness of this area of work. And so this is something that the EIAP project has really been focusing on over the last 3 years. And I just wanted to, before we move over to Peter to talk more about the guide that has been produced in this work, I just wanted to talk about some of the highlights of the findings from the meta-evaluation and the wider literature review. And essentially, what came out of these 2 pieces of work is that the evidence that we found was relatively weak. Few of the evaluations provided well-defined evaluation criteria, clearly stated objectives, clear visions of what it was that they were wanting to change. And all of this really led to an absence of a clear objective judgment of the program's contributions. Almost no evaluations consistently included conclusions supported by strong evidence. So what we saw in a lot of the evaluations were self-reporting of those who are implementing the project or of local partners, and relatively few attempts to go outside and gather outside perspectives or collect independently verifiable data or to triangulate data findings. None of the evaluations appeared to implement conflict or gender-sensitive evaluation processes. And then we found an interesting reliance on change at the individual level as well, and change and belief in attitude and behaviour change that would hopefully lead to more systemic and wider changes in terms of the conflict dynamics. But that link was not established in the evidence. So, obviously some evidence to show that attitudes would change, but the wider conflict dynamics, behavioural change at a broader systemic level, there was little or no evidence for. And then lastly, the other thing we found is that the work of secular organisations are often not sufficiently sensitive to faith-based issues, to the interreligious dimensions and potential of the programmes that they're working on in areas where clearly religion and religious identity is a significant factor. So let me leave it there by way of sort of setting the context, and let me hand over to Peter to talk more about the actual development of the guide.
So once having done the meta-evaluation and literature review, we worked to develop a guide, and in that work we had good help from a global advisory council. I'm not going to go through all the names on this slide. It's going to flash by, and all those names are in the guide itself, so if you want to go back and see who was there. I think we got most major religions involved. I think we didn't have a Hindu, at least not, there was an out Hindu in the process. So I think we missed at least that dimension, but most other major religions were there. And they helped us define what the guide should look like, reviewed an early detailed outline of the guide, and sort of gave us some sense of where we should be going with this product. So the Global Advisory Council has been really crucial right through the process. And I would say that at least two members of the Advisory Council are in the building somewhere. Mala Leguro from the Catholic Relief Services is somewhere here. And Rick Love from the Peace Catalyst International has been around as well. I didn't think they came up for this session. They probably felt that they had learned enough about this and didn't need to be involved. And I would also say that Bob Berg, the chairman of the Alliance, was also participating in some of the activities as well, although not a formal member of the Alliance board. So out of all that, we developed a draft guide, and then tested it with in the field with 7 organizations, 4 of them chosen as mostly local level grassroots peacebuilding organizations in a couple of different places, and then some international organizations who volunteered to test the guide, some of them because they were involved in the Global Advisory Council, others were just interested and willing to help out. So the guide was tested in Uganda, Pakistan, Jerusalem, a program that was both in Kenya and Lebanon, and then a Myanmar effort, a big multi-continent large program from CRS that was quite interesting and involved, and then a program from Search for Common Ground in Kyrgyzstan. So those from sort of November 2016 through the spring of 2017, this field testing was going on, and then we were collecting feedback from people in the spring that led up to a consultation in Vienna. What month was that?
8th of May, I think.
In May, where we brought representatives from the tester organizations, all 7, and the Global Advisory Council to look at the results of the field testing, the feedback that we had received, talked about how the guide needed to be changed. It's one of those unfortunate processes where everybody had an idea about something that should be added, and that very few people had anything to suggest about what might be taken out. So the thing kept growing and growing. So now it's almost 250 pages. And there were some reasons for that, and I'll come back to that in a bit. So then the period from May through August, we revised the guide, updated it, rewrote some sections, did the usual copy editing, which Mary helped us do, which was really great, and then went into the production process, which is largely done by Jack, who's in the back of the room from Search for Common Ground. He, I think, spent his evenings and weekends working on it for a good deal of time, and produced the final version of the guide out there. So what is in the guide? So there's a introduction which has some definitions, like how did we define interreligious action, some basic terminology, what is monitoring, what's evaluation, how are they different, those kinds of things. Obviously not for the professional evaluation people, because they know that stuff, but for the people that are just learning about this kind of thing, we felt that some basic definitions need to be in there. The second section really looks at this interreligious action area and says, well, how is this distinct from other areas of peacebuilding practice, and why do we need a guide specifically about that? What are the particular considerations when looking at an interreligious program that may not be there for a water and sanitation program with a little bit of peacebuilding thrown in, or your typical dialogue program between political parties or something like that? When you add the faith dimension, what happens to the experience of people, and why should we think about that differently? And what are the considerations of what we started to call in the process faith sensitivity, sort of echoing conflict sensitivity, but where you're working with faith groups, how do you need to be aware of the cultural religious symbols, the ways that people think and work that are different from the sort of other kinds of programming. Then the next sections really became a little bit more technical in terms of design and monitoring of interreligious programs. The design section is fairly short, but tries to encapsulate some of what we learned about good design, including analysis, theories of change, those kinds of things. There's a nice section that goes through the typical theories of change in this kind of interreligious action programming, and what the implications are that for M&E. Then went on to, well, then if you're preparing for an evaluation, I think this would be largely helpful to people in organizations that are commissioning evaluations. So if you're in the M&E unit of X organization and you're helping your field program develop an evaluation, some of the things you need to think about, or if you're a field-based person considering doing an evaluation, what would you need to do to get ready for that? And then the sort of nuts and bolts of implementing an evaluation, hiring an evaluator, getting it done, and then the quite important part of following up and dealing with the evaluation itself. So I'm going to skip some things here. So some of the faith-based distinctions that are in the guide. So faith-based groups understand accountability in a different way than secular groups do. So who are you accountable to in a faith-based operation? And that may be very different depending on the religious group you're thinking about. Some accountability to a higher entity in some senses might be there, as opposed to some secular group, or even to the populations you might be working with. There might be some mix of those things, but certainly that sort of higher power entity consideration might be there. The value systems are very powerful in interreligious action. I think that is pretty self-evident. But even understanding of success and failure may be quite different. You may be working in a very long-term time frame. Most of us work on project cycles of 3 years, 5 years, those kinds of things. If you're working on long-term interreligious action, you may be thinking in terms of decades, because your commitment is not just to some project, but it is to transformation in a different kind of sense. Many religious actors, from whatever faith you're talking about, are not necessarily motivated by the organizational demands of funding, but because they feel a calling to do that work. Whatever the religious language is around that, that sense that you're doing the work because it's the work that needs to be done, and out of a sense of religious commitment or understanding is certainly part of that. And that isn't always the case for those of us who are working in the secular sphere, although individually we may be motivated that way. There's a whole element of spiritual transformation that seems to run through a lot of the interreligious action. So it's related to this issue about individual transformation and how that translates into social transformation, but that is clearly part of what's going on. Some of the implications we found for M&E, one is that participatory processes need to be core to what's done, to engage the people that are involved in a project, so you're not just sort of coming in and doing a sort of extractive process. A lot of it needs to be qualitative. In these kinds of settings, quantitative data are really rare and hard to find. So interviews, focus groups, engagements of people in various ways for qualitative data are going to be needed. And we had a lot of suggestions that thinking about systems and complexity needs to be part of the scene, because the settings that we're dealing with are subject to dynamic change, and we need to be taking account of that, not only in the programming itself, but in the evaluation needs to take account of that complexity. I'm going to skip this slide. I'm going to skip that one to go to the challenges, because I think that may be part of the discussion we want to have. So we had very diverse stakeholders from small, local, religiously oriented groups who didn't have projects per se, but had those ongoing commitments to dialogue and reconciliation at their community level, all the way up to large international NGOs that had, the program of CRS that was multiple continents and had probably multiple donors. So there was a real diversity in those stakeholders, as well as the difference between the faith-based groups themselves or secular groups working with faith-based groups and the professional evaluators. So how do we deal with all those audiences? And at one point they said, well, there should be 2 guides, and there's still an ongoing debate about whether the guide that we came up with should be sort of pulled apart and made different for different groups. So that was a big debate all the way through. I've already mentioned where there's no project in the classical sense, but it's an ongoing commitment to work. How do you get some sense of reflection and learning from that kind of process? All along, there's this question about, is there anything unique about interreligious action that requires us to think differently about it? So there was a constant pushing back on that. There was a debate throughout about how much we should deal with the countering violent extremism, PVE kinds of processes, because some people are using, maybe manipulating religious actors to try to get at those issues of counterterrorism or countering extremism. In this initial process, we didn't feel as though we could go completely into that, or it would have taken over the whole process. So we did an initial take, and maybe in subsequent phases we can go more deeply into that. But it was a tension and a set of pushes and pulls that went through the process. The whole issue, which I've already mentioned, about pushing beyond individual transformation was part of the discussion. We also had some real strong debates that went on for weeks on email between people who were very much committed to the classical results-based management, log frames, indicators, goals, objectives, all those kinds of things that we all love, versus people that were much more looking at emergent processes, most significant change kinds of technologies for evaluation, much more less sort of indicator-oriented and more open-ended, and also bringing in systems kinds of approaches. So those debates were going all the way through. So those are some of the things that just to introduce the guide to you.
Thanks, Peter. Great. Okay, now let's move to James and hear some more reflections on the methodological challenges and some of your experience at ICRD.
Yeah, thank you. I think Peter asked a good question that I'll depart from, which is, how are these actors different? You know, why are we even having this conversation? Why is this guide even derived? It must be because we consider this to be a space that has some unique aspect to it. I think the challenges I've seen in a lot of institutions have been that when faith actors are engaged, they're engaged much more as actors and much less as faith. So the faith piece of faith actor tends to fall away, and faith actors can be engaged as important individuals, but oftentimes this question of the transcendent is left aside. So in truth, I think there has to be a process of demythologizing faith and religion for secular actors, but frankly also demythologizing the secular for faith actors. And what does that look like? I propose that faith functions, religion functions in society much the way that any other identity group might function. And I kind of have this triangle in my mind where the pinnacle of the triangle are infrastructures or structures. So faith and religion have infrastructures and structures. They have buildings and physical resources. They also have physical reach. And that's true of any identity group. On the bottom left corner, there's the community. Community in faith and any other identity group is about narratives, belonging. There are mobilizers there, people who can activate the community. And then there's the other corner, which is about individuals and individual discernment, values, and motives. And I think that's where the distinction is housed for faith and religious actors. I think it's important to recognize so much of what faith and religion does in society is similar to other spaces, which can help demythologize it for secular actors. So there are ways that you can measure these different pieces in action. But what is it about this unique part of motives and reflection and discernment that has to do with the transcendent that makes this a challenge for us? The challenge really then is to find a way to create a measurable transformation in spiritual conformity to the divine will through practical action. What do I mean by that? I mean, when people go back to this individual values and motives question, which is to say, motives are driven by the transcendent reward or punishment concept. What will happen to me afterwards if I do or don't do this, if I don't live up to the divine will? Where is reward and punishment? With many traditional identity groups, reward and punishment is lived out in the present. You think of, you know, a gang member who's encouraged in that community corner by a mobilizer to make the individual decision to kill somebody. The reward and punishment for that decision will be lived out in the present in that community. If they decide not to, they'll be rejected and sometimes face their own punishment. If they decide to, then they'll be embraced and probably elevated within that community space. What happens in the spiritual when a spiritual mobilizer, a faith leader or a faith influencer encourages an individual to make the same decision? Then the accountability to reward and punishment is often transcendent and not in the temporal. That makes it hard to measure that piece of influence on the actor, right? The same is true of discernment. The reflection, the internal reflection on values, which happens when those individuals make those decisions, which is always true of any community. The individual still has to make the decision to act. Discernment in terms of the example of the gang is going to be looking at, you know, the human values that work against killing somebody else versus the values of belonging to this group and coming up with a decision about which value is more important. In the transcendent, those values and that discernment often has to do with a conversation with the divine, reflecting on the movement of the spirits, as the Jesuits would call it, and trying to discern which way one should go to be in conformity with the will of the divine. So the challenge is to take that little corner, that piece of the relationship of the transcendent, and somehow make it relate to the practical world, so that the spiritual actor can also see the relationship of their discernment, their motives, their values to the practical effects that it has on the world, and the secular actor can see the value of that spiritual and transcendent relationship in terms of mobilizing and motivating the individual as an actor that can be a colleague or a collaborator. So in many ways it's going from the idea of it's in God's hands to God will evaluate me the following way if I behave a certain way in the world. That's really the bridge that we're trying to make, to help the spiritual actor recognize that there are influences of their behavior on the practical world and vice versa that do have transcendent implications, right? I think you can make theories of change out of these things, right? But they tend to be they tend to have a different element within them, and I think this is where secular actors have to become religiously literate, but I don't mean that in terms of knowing the core tenets of any particular faith tradition, but knowing that faith is important and why and how, however, whatever faith is manifesting there, right? And then the theories of change can start to reflect that faith proposition. So instead of just saying if we build a certain number of wells, we will provide water to the community. If we provide water to the community, there'll be less water conflict in the region. It's more along the lines of if the institutions, the top of that triangle, are diverting their resources more to this kind of work, then we're seeing a transformation in the institutional thinking. And that's a measurable impact of the way that the spiritual institution is thinking about its requirements for action. Same is true about the mobilizers in the community. If you start to see the work being aligned with the understanding of community values and the drivers for belonging in the community, preachers and other people saying this work is God's will, or you do this work as a Christian, Muslim, Hindu, other, because that's who you are as your identity, then you are starting to see measurable transformation, again, in terms of evaluating the broader impact on the positive impact of the programming. And it's true for the individual level as well. If an individual starts to correlate these behaviors with the divine will and starts to see the discernment as saying, I need to do X in the world because God is driving me to do so by virtue of reward punishment or my core value set, and you start to see a correlation of these two things, then you're able to track and measure the impact of the programming on this transcendent element of reflection, discernment, and reward and punishment. It's easy to measure outputs a lot of times around this kind of programming. This goes back to engaging individuals as actors more than individual faith practice. But I think those are examples of where out comes the kind of transformation of thinking, transformation of broader relationships can also become part of the measure when you're looking at the transcendent. There are tools that we can use now that weren't necessarily available to us in the past that sort of allow us to get around some of these challenges and look more deeply at spiritual intentions. And I would raise as an example artificial intelligence or big data analysis, where instead of doing direct surveys with people, where sometimes the survey is hard to get at the spiritual intention, you ask someone, do you think God is driving you to do this? Or how many times are you praying? But how do we link the prayer to the program impact? Or instead of doing that, you look at trends in narratives. You look at the way that people are speaking. And you do this not consciously engaging with the individual to respond to the question, but you do it by mapping these kinds of narratives and communications using the big data and the AI. And you can get at a sense of are the ideas changing around the spirituality and its relationship to the program. Now, a more concrete example of how this functions, and I just have 1 minute, so I'll end with this, is I recall in our program in Colombia, we're working with women of faith there to engage in reconciliation to help reintegrate former combatants. And most of these women of faith are victims of violence. So they're trying to grapple with what it means to be someone who's suffered violence, but work with perpetrators of violence in a constructive, positive way. And at one point they took a break from the workshop that we were doing, and they went and they left the room and came back in draped in sheets and acted out, these were all Christian women in this particular workshop, but they acted out a pageant from the Bible. They acted out the adulteress's tale, where she's dragged through the streets and thrown in the dust in front of Jesus, if you know the story. And Jesus famously says, "Let the one among you who has not sinned throw the first stone." And less famously then says to her, "Go and not sin again." So those of you who are into reconciliation and non-repetition, this is a very important element of that. But they were using not only the text, but their spiritual and visceral engagement with the text to make sense of the concepts that we were trying to teach. And the effect that had was twofold. It allowed them to work through their own pain by using their doctrine and their belonging and the transcendent element. So this is a God's will thing here. I can get over what are hurdles for me in engaging in this process by leaning on God's will. But it also allowed them to get very profound in terms of their understanding of the topics that we were trying to get across. So it wasn't just intellectual, that their intellectual engagement with the concepts, but they had a spiritual engagement with these concepts that then made their commitment to the practice of this so much more profound. Now these, again, are challenging things to learn how to measure, but they're profoundly impactful things when you bring the faith element and faith question into the work of peace building. So I'll leave it there, but
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Thanks. Okay, so getting closer to the ground and to practice and how some of this plays out when we actually have programs and have the challenge of monitoring and evaluating them. Nell, if you can sort of tell us about your experience from your project in Kenya.
I'd be glad to. I'd like to share our recent experience of evaluating the CIRCA project. CIRCA stands for Capacity, it's for Interreligious Community Action. This was a 3-year, 6-country project operating in Egypt, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Nigeria, and Niger, funded by GHR Foundation. And the project entailed 2 major components in each of these 6 countries. One component was training, the other was practice. And so in the training component, we had participants from faith-based partner organizations, some Christian, some Muslim, some interfaith, including on the Kenyan coast traditionalists, along with Christians and Muslims. And participants from these partner organizations took part together in each country in a pretty intensive training program over time to prepare them for interreligious peace-building action together. It included 8 modules that were rolled out over a 2-year period. So we're talking sort of a consistent process of both formation and relationship building over time. The practical application component consisted of these trainees, which is what I'll call them for the purpose of the evaluation report, then going and working with Christian and Muslim community members to jointly envision, plan, and implement a very tangible development project to address a pressing development need in their community. So getting community members working alongside each other in this process. The evaluation of this project would have been complex under any circumstances. We're talking 6 countries, 18 partner organizations, 12 connector project sites, and we certainly had many other challenges that would have come up even if we weren't evaluating interreligious action. But I'm going to try to stick here in our limited time just to the interreligious components. Briefly, though, the evaluation was primarily qualitative evaluation, utilization-focused evaluation, with two primary purposes. The first was to assess the merit and significance of the project, in part according to its own indicators that had already been set forth in the project design. The second component was to use the evaluation as an opportunity for learning, and to try to extract some sense of factors that are at play in effective interreligious action. So, looking at the interreligious aspect of this evaluation, I wanted to call attention to three, what I'll call inflection points, where I think it mattered that we were evaluating an interreligious peacebuilding program. And the first is the readiness of the evaluator. We were very fortunate in this evaluation to be able to be working with an external evaluator who not only had history with the project, he had worked with us on the baseline, but who also had some involvement with EIAP, who had already an openness to considering and probing and really looking below the surface of the religious and faith dimensions of this program with us. And I would contrast that with a recent experience we had in another country where we were looking at interreligious peace building, and the evaluation team, while quite professional and thorough in their considerations, tended to focus much more on questions which are appropriate of relevance of an interreligious peace building effort in that context, and the question of whether faith actors could actually be called upon to play a constructive role in that society's conflict was clearly a pressing question for the evaluation team, in a way that received the bulk of the focus, and not so much this deeper probing of the faith dimensions and what exactly were the dynamics happening within that engagement of the faith actors. But in Circa, we were able to do that. The second inflection point comes in the evaluation design, and particularly in the shaping of the evaluation questions. And so we did have there really was a lot of room that was made for learning. And we were able to include a number of evaluation questions that looked not just at the effectiveness component, but also at how the participants themselves understood the religious dimensions of their work together and their experience together, how participants themselves understood the success of the project, what lessons we could glean from the change process, and this question of the connection between the personal transformation process and the effects in the community, as well as looking at the gender dimensions of the project in a faith context. The third inflection point relates to the first two, and it has to do with how, in the analysis process, the evaluator was able to pull out, using various analytical frames, to pull out the typologies that were emerging in terms of the implications of the programming on the faith dimensions of the participants' experiences and of their interactions. And so, to give you a couple of examples, even in the evaluation questions that were focused more on effectiveness of the program, we were able to get some really good learning about the interreligious components. So, one of the evaluation questions was about how effectively the trained partner organizations worked with community members to support them in their connector project. And one of the things that we were able to conclude from the evaluation was that there was a very telling differentiation between how community members viewed that support and how the trainees themselves viewed that support, because the trainees were much more likely to be able to articulate and identify what our evaluator was calling pastoral roles of support. That is to say, the very important role that is played by their own modeling of interreligious cooperation, the legitimization of interacting across religious lines in very polarized and divided communities where there isn't a lot of trust across religious lines. The convening power of these religious actors and leaders. Whereas the community members participating in the Connector project were much more likely to focus on the practical forms of support, the actual logistical and budgetary assistance with the Connector project. And so there was a big distinction that could be drawn between the pastoral roles and the practical roles, and who identified those. Another example, there was an evaluation question about how the partners were more effectively engaging in interreligious development and action. And we could see the way in which the trainees' own deeper understanding of their own faith was a key element in increasing their confidence to be able to engage across religious lines. A couple of other key findings that came out of this analysis that I wanted to share with you had to do with the question of how the participants understood success. Here again, we saw a really interesting distinction between the perspectives of community members and trainees. The trainees were much more likely to talk about the how of the collaboration as an element of success, the fact that there were stronger relationships that were being built, and the evidence they gave ranged everything from people eating together to various forms of interaction. The fact that conflicts were now being handled in different and more constructive ways. The fact that there was a certain level of recognition and appreciation from both community members and local authorities for this kind of interreligious action. And the just general openness to interreligious collaboration was coming out. Community members who participated in the connector projects were much more likely to define success in terms of the concrete, practical development outcome. So we are actually implementing a second phase of this project, again with support from GHR, and that is actually, we're taking some of this learning because what it suggests to us is that there is a real need to find ways of, if not exactly replicating, at least extending the important element of formation, training, learning, dialogue, discussion that was happening among the partner participants to the community level, and to engage them in exploration of the faith values and traditions alongside their cooperative work together. Lastly, another finding that I wish to share with you is that the evaluation helped us to identify the ways in which this project was creating space for various forms of motivation for engagement in interreligious action through a trifold sort of set of motivations: the spiritual, the cognitive, and the practical. So it was creating kind of an umbrella under which people who were primarily driven by their spiritual values and faith values could find a place for themselves. Those who were really committed to learning more about how exactly do we build peace, do we build cohesion, do we build development in our communities could find a place. And those who are really interested in the practical aspect could also find a place. So we're also looking at where we can take that framework forward. So I'll stop there because my time is up.
Yep, okay, thank you, Noel. Okay. Lastly but not least, Jennifer. if you could,
Okay.
tell us
I'll
about
try to
it.
run through this really fast so we can get to the discussion parts. What I want to share with you is something that USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation is exploring right now in its evaluation. We haven't done all the data collection yet, so maybe this time next year we'll actually be able to share with you some of the findings. But what I want to focus on for this next couple of minutes is the challenges of an evaluator in considering religion as you're looking at programs. Just quickly, who here is professionally affiliated with what you would call a faith-based organization? Okay, a couple folks. And then who has evaluation responsibilities that pertain to religion or religious dynamics? Is anyone facing that particular challenge? Okay, not so much. You probably will start getting more and more questions about this, so hopefully this can give you an idea. And my focus is really going to be on the challenges and the do no harm considerations. So as you're designing your evaluation, as you're implementing your evaluation, what do you need to take into consideration that might be a little bit specialized given the faith components? I want to just give you a quick overview of the CMM's People-to-People Reconciliation Fund, the thematic evaluation that my team has been tasked with, and then 3 challenges and 5 do no harms. So to get to the question and answer, I'll probably just highlight them and not go into a lot of detail, but if any of them are especially interesting, then we can follow up. The CMMs, the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, has a annual small grant program that's called their People to People Reconciliation Fund. All of these projects are designed to encourage interactions and transformation of relationships in order to promote or create opportunities for more peaceful relations. This particular learning activity was initiated by CMM, and the purpose of the evaluation is to provide guidance for other U.S. aid, in particular funded programming, so implementers, on where you might look for opportunities in your design of your programs as it relates to faith. So contributing to the community of practice. So the evaluation is intended to be utilized really by implementers and then also by donors that maybe want to design certain opportunities that take these validated learning into account. The program, as Nick mentioned, looked at 4 different CMM-funded projects, 2 in South Thailand where there are relevant dynamics to Buddhism or Buddhist actors and Muslim actors, and then 2 in CAR where there are dynamics related to Muslim actors and Christian actors. These programs were not specifically faith-based, so I'm going to just move into our challenges in implementing this particular evaluation. There's challenges around definitions, which has been touched on. There's challenges around centrality of religion. So does it really have anything to do with these programs or not? And then 3, identity complexity. The first one with definitions is probably very obvious, but even just starting out, what is religion? What counts as religion? What doesn't count as religion? How do we put those into those neat boxes? Who is a religious actor versus a secular actor versus a secular actor that is personally motivated by religious values? So as an evaluator, you're pushed to identify how you are categorizing your various respondents and respondent groups. Same with institutions. Thailand is a really great example where the government is so closely aligned with Buddhist practice that is it truly a secular institution or is it something different from that? So those are challenges that we are facing. The other is centrality of religion. So with all 4 projects, especially in Thailand, the implementers really did not want to characterize their programs as faith-based programs. And it's related to one of the do no harm issues that I'll mention later. A lot of these conflicts are oversimplified to be religious conflicts. And the implementers were concerned that our evaluation would reinforce that mischaracterization of the dynamics. And so trying to work with your implementers or the program that you're evaluating in such a way that you are aware of the conflict assessment and that the way you're talking about religion isn't characterizing the operating environment in certain ways. And they were very resistant to talk, the staff in particular. When we got into the field and talked to the program participants, it was all about religion. So that was a different, interesting difference between the reactions to these kind of questions. Identity complexity is really important, and this isn't just a religious or faith-sensitive evaluation, but you want to make sure to consider it that your religious identity might be really relevant under certain circumstances, but under other circumstances, your gender, your age, where you live, where you came from, your economic status may be much more relevant. So if you're disaggregating your data, you want to be careful to say, is it really the identity of religion that is explaining your findings, or is there some other something else that you want to take into consideration? So then there's 5 do no harm considerations that I'll just mention. One is about power dynamics. 2 is about instrumentalization. 3 is threats of violence. 4 is religious identity of your evaluation team. And 5 are safe spaces. So very quickly, power dynamics, when you're dealing with religion, there is a lot of hierarchy in religious institutions and religious practices that are important to consider to make sure that you are looking at a diversity of voices that aren't just at the leadership level, that also can include community members who identify with a certain religion. Instrumentalization, we hear a lot of this around CVE, that there's manipulation of religion toward violence. So what does that look like if there is manipulation or use of religion towards peace building? And what are the risks of kind of thinking about it in those ways, and how should you be cautious about not reinforcing or oversimplifying? Threats of violence, we definitely found this, especially in Thailand, that if we had to be sensitive of the fact that certain respondents that we were dealing with were really at risk of talking about peace building because of their religious leader identity. And in particular, these were the imams. So if we needed to take that into account when we were inviting them to participate in our evaluation, realizing that they were taking real risks by agreeing to have these conversations. The evaluation, the identity of your evaluation team becomes very relevant in terms of trust and how your respondents are going to react to you. If your team are all Christian or all Buddhist, then that can communicate something to your respondents about bias. So you really want to make sure that you have paid attention to relationship building as you enter into your communications with the respondents. And then the last is just about safe spaces, that temples or mosques or churches might be welcoming spaces for some organizations and might be unwelcoming for other religious identities. Same with government institutions. Government institutions are not necessarily religious neutral. So paying attention to that as an evaluator is important as well. So I'll just stop there. Hopefully next year we'll be able to have overcome some of those challenges and share with you what some of the lessons learned are.
Great. Okay, well, look, lots of food for thought there, and hopefully stimulus for questions. So I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and yeah, I'd like to start.
And they mentioned there's a mic in the back that they'd like us to use. So.
Okay, yes.
And,
Okay.
and let me just say that I'm going to have to leave in about 5 minutes. Unfortunately, I have to catch a transport. So if you want questions for me.
Okay, so we have 3 questions. We have one at the back, the lady here in the middle, and then one behind you.
Thank you very much.
I think it doesn't amplify,
It's
just
recorded.
to record. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentations. My question has to do with the assumption here that I did not hear whether religion here is already taken to be useful for the work of whether it's of peace or of development. There is some kind of a neutral view of religion. Is there a sense that in the process of relating to religion in development work, we are also looking at the possibility that it is being transformed in the process? Or is it that it's taken for granted, it's taken at face value that it is going to make a positive contribution?
Okay, thank you. And the lady here in the middle?
Hi, I'm Suzanne Abadian. I have 2 questions. One is, in the context of communities I've worked with that had social change and that were introducing spiritual or religious values in the work that they were doing, it often looked like nothing was happening for a period of 6-7 years. And the way I described it was that it was a tipping effect. So nothing looked like was happening, and then the 7th and 8th year, all of a sudden things would tip and 95% of the community would change or something would happen. So in terms of success, when we're looking at evaluating, it's a little difficult, it seems, to judge what success looks like if we're looking short term. So that's, how do we get around that issue? That's one question I have. And the second question is, what do we do about things that don't fit neatly in religious categories? So for example, if we were evaluating Gandhi and what he did, which religion would we assign him to? Or even MLK, Martin Luther King, I mean, he brought lots of people on board, lots of religious groups, and how do we, and what we need now perhaps isn't any one religion, or we're looking at obviously multiple faiths and even beyond religion sometimes. So I wondered about that kind of plurality. I don't know how to describe it, but spirituality beyond a religion. So.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, just one behind you, and then we'll have the responses.
Hi, Elton Scully, Manchester University. So I have two brief questions. The first one is, has there been a way to look at the comparative effectiveness of interfaith versus secular groups? That will be a big kind of interesting way to look at whether there is a big premium of actually engaging the interfaith groups. The second question, and it's more like, is about looking at religion as an identity group and as a function. So there is a lot of social identity theories, and I mean, you can see nationalism has the same logic of appropriateness. I do this for my country, for my community, right? Whether and nationalism is, you could define it according to religion, language, etc. So I'm wondering then, if we say religion is just like any type of identity group, again, what makes it special? I mean, because even the group is transcendental. The nation is imagined as lying before me and after me, right? It's not, and people view it as, even though it's like, it's not like in terms of divine, but it's also viewed as like a good that goes beyond oneself. Thank you.
Okay, right, let's hear the responses. So just to recap, there's a question on whether we're just assuming that involving religious actors is actually a positive thing. I think that was the question you asked. Also something about the speed of change and how we measure success, particularly over long time periods. There was a question about the plurality of identities that are often associated with religion, and maybe an openness to thinking a little bit more layered or nuanced, not just in terms of single identity associations. And then a question about comparative analysis, how effective are secular interventions compared with faith-based interventions. And then lastly, a question about, I think, again, more what makes this religious dimension or faith-based approach special, separate from other identity formations.
I'll take a crack and then dash for the door. I'd like to address the thing about delay. I don't think that's unique to this kind of programming. And I think it's a challenge for all of us who are doing work under short-term grants, 3-5 year cycles, when the type of change we're looking for may be at the 15 or 20, even generational kinds of change. I think the challenge then is to find what I would call early indicators of change, and not indicators in the classic sense of that people use indicators, because I think those are quite rigid and often unhelpful, but much broader inquiry about what's changed and why, sort of in the most significant change kind of modality, although there's other technologies and methodologies that get to some of that same thing, that say, are we even moving in the right direction? So, classically people look at a training program, and so people attend it, check the box. Well, then what did people do with the training? How did they feel that they were affected by that training? What were they doing 6 months later that might have indicated some change in behavior or consciousness? So those are micro level changes that then might over time start to have that larger effect. We had this question come up when we were doing some work around the Philippines, where there are thousands of people who are getting this culture of peace training. There are multiple, dozens of organizations that were training people in the communities, and the police and the military, all getting culture of peace training. And at a certain point, it seemed to have a tipping point, where when the next crisis arose, people reacted differently. And they said, wait a minute, no, okay, we're not supposed to act that way. We're not supposed to, take up arms and attack each other. Cultural peace training says we need to stop, and think about what we're doing, enter dialogue, and the reactions were different. But that was after probably 5 years of that kind of intensive training. And I don't think anybody's done that kind of comparative analysis to say, was that religious or secular, or were religious groups more effective than the non-religious groups? I don't think those studies that Elton was talking about have been done. But I think that issue of time delay remains, I think, an interesting puzzle for all of us in whatever whatever setting, not just the religious setting, or the faith-based setting.
Yeah.
And apologies that I have to run, but.
All right, I'll just give a quick response that religion was not seen as neutral. It was not seen as positive or negative. It was the possibilities for both depending on circumstances and the person before us. And I think that's really important, is not to assume that it's positive or that it's negative, and obviously it can be different in the same context under different circumstances. The multiple identities, the Gandhi example as one, is absolutely a part of this. Faith is only one aspect of an identity, even for institutions. And you find that respondents will often use code when it's not appropriate, and you see this in this country, not appropriate to say, well, it's the Muslims. But you might say it's the Malay, or the shepherds, or the traders. And so that's, as an evaluator, you have to really kind of be sensitive to all of those other identities that may have religion as an overlay, or be substituting in that way as well. And then I'll just say the interfaith versus secular, we never had groups that, we also did intra, so within a religious group we had focus groups with people who are all from the same religion and those that were from different religions. And that, as an evaluator, is really complicated to tease out, because oftentimes in conflict settings there is a dominant religion, or a religion that has access to more resources or rights. And so if you put them into the same group, are you getting a really candid conversation or not? So that's just something else as an evaluator. You definitely, just because they're all secular in terms of maybe their duties, it doesn't mean that they have the same status.
Yeah, and I would agree that, I'm sorry, did you want to?
No, go ahead.
I'm just going down the line. All right.
Carry
It's
on.
not so much whether involving religion is a good idea or a bad idea. It's the question of, is it salient? You've got 85% of the global population, 84% of the global population self-describes as religious. And I contend a big portion of the other 15% have some spiritual process. So it's in the room, right? And the question then is, what do you do about it? And in cases where it is the most important motivator for individuals beyond other kind of identity motivators, then you have to know how to work with it, right? And so improving your knowledge on how to work with it and how it functions is another tool in your toolkit. But you have to do a good analysis on whether or not it's there, why it should or shouldn't be used, and if it is or is not functioning in a positive or negative way. I think that goes kind of to the last question, which is, what makes religion special? Maybe what we need to ask instead is, what can we learn about this focus on religion? What can we learn from that we can apply to other identities? Why aren't we taking certain cultural identities as seriously? And the motives and the mobilization around that happens in the discernment and all the value sets and everything. Maybe we need to just learn a principle around identity drivers that's a little broader. But I will say there are some things that are distinct about religion. One of them that can be frustrating is something I call the, it's in God's hands principle, which is, oftentimes leads to some of the delays in programming successes that we heard about, because it's the idea that, well, there's an interventionist deity that is in charge of this, and this is the will of that deity, and therefore I'm passive in the face of that. So sometimes mobilizing religious actors can be a challenge. So there are some things about the transcendent, that's just one example, but some things about the transcendent that I think do have a significant impact in a distinct way. And then just the last one I want to touch on is does this work change the religion? That's a really interesting question. This is the Schrodinger's cat problem, right? And I think that the answer is absolutely yes, right? I think about the kind of thing that we do in ICRD, for example, around violent extremism, where we find help facilitate and then foment narratives of countering violent extremism, or find certain interpretations of faith traditions or encourage certain interpretations of faith traditions that are nonviolent and work against violent conflict. We have an agenda there, and I'm unabashed about the agenda. We want to resist violent conflict in the world. But in doing so, we are injecting resources, whether it be time, energy, or money, into shaping a certain element within a faith tradition so that it's stronger. And that necessarily will have an impact on the religious tradition. So I think we have to be incredibly aware of that and careful with that. I think it's a very important point.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that same point, that same aspect of the extent to which engaging religion ends up transforming religion. And we work, similar to what's already been said, we work really hard to avoid essentializing religion. And through our programming, not to sort of hold up good religion, bad religion as a dichotomous reality, but the reality is that all religious traditions are plural internally within themselves. And what we're doing is inviting people into a process of really exploring their own tradition in great depth, as well as learning about that of the other, and finding those points, not just of commonality, but also difference, because part of being able to live in union together in a really sincere and meaningful way is being able to find a way of saying, yeah, this is where we're together, and this is where we're different. This is how we understand each other in that process. And I'll just maybe come back around to where Peter started us on the time frame question. We are really glad to be implementing a second phase of the Circa project, because one of the things we started seeing glimmers of towards the end of the first project had to do with the sort of the transition between individual and personal and relational change into more institutional change, both within the partner organizations, but also in the roles that they were performing in society beyond these connector projects. And it does take time, I think, in any peace-building project to begin to see those kinds of ripple effects. But I think it may provide a useful opportunity to look at one of the questions that came up from EIAP around how to get beyond the level of personal and relational transformation into this more structural and institutional change. And we're starting to see some of that fruit in the form of new partner organizations, both inviting one another into broader platforms and processes for leadership in society, as well as being noticed and looked at by authorities and for their potential. I meant to earlier pass out just a little brief from our evaluation experience. So I'll just circulate these back around the room. Thank you, Jessica. And I also have a couple of copies of a case study book that includes this case study and a few others for those who might be interested. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Look, I'm going to thank all the panelists for their contributions, and thank you for being here and for asking your questions. And we're out of time, unfortunately, but if you have any further questions you'd like to ask any of us, please come up and we can maybe continue the conversation over coffee. So thank you very much again for being here. Thank you.
Does somebody need an adapter for video? Oh, great. You guys are leaving now, right?
People are coming and people are going.
And people are coming in for a new meeting?
Right. There is a PowerPoint setup, right? PowerPoint?
It should be on the machine, yes.
Okay.
Oh, we need power.
All right, cool.
For this device.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks.
I need to go get the power supply for this. Be right back with the power supply for that laptop.
Okay.
Did you bring PowerPoint?
Yes. But he had to go get a power supply.
Okay.
For the laptop.
for?
I just realized that I have a.
Oh, he has everything. Never mind. I'm not gonna worry about what he's doing.
And I realized I got to change this.
The thing I just did is here. Google Doc is like the best thing ever invented, right? It's up there. It's up there, man. Yeah, I get overexcited about new technology. I know it's not new anymore, but my daughter wanted me to edit a paper that she was submitting for something, and I was all excited that I was in Dallas and we were on the phone, and she's changing it while I tell her, that doesn't sound so good, and then we were done.
Neat.
That's Google Doc. That's amazing. And I was all excited. She was like, Mom, this is nothing anymore. I know what you mean. A typewriter in college.
Right, right. I remember.
Yes. You mean behind like this? Yeah. Oh, okay. That's the hard part. Looks like it's going to depend on the lost and found. Do you have a lost and found? Okay. And good luck with that. Yeah. Yes. Good. I just thought it was left here. No need for lost and found. Yeah. So just what type just puts. Oh. That would be nice. Just saying it just we need to make it big. Just skip over that. Maybe 20. So just wait for the handies. I know what to add. Sorry. We're just trying to make a circle. Okay, so we're just trying to make a circle. It's a reunion for you guys, right?
Yay!
Oh, we'll just put them right behind the circle with the post-it. We'll use them for the.
What's it say? It's broken?
Computer is in use, has been locked.
Oh no.
You should change your battery or switch your outlet.
Okay, well we've got enough power now, but that was an old dialogue. It's the battery one, so we'll clear that one. Should be open.
I was gonna say, did we meet like virtually, like on a video call or something? I think so too.
And then you don't need your microphones. This was for the recording. You're not recording your session, correct?
I don't think so.
And here's the dowser for this.
Okay.
Once it's set, you can just slide this closed, and the projector stays on, light stays on. When you're ready to see it, you just go click, and it's going.
It's on right now?
It's coming up because it's either been turned off improperly or something, but I can fix that. I'll deplug and plug back in for a quick restart. Remember that the next time your projector says, I'm not going to restart for you for 90 seconds. Minimum. That's the way they are because of their, something else might be wrong. It is blinking. I have a blinking light. We might have to go get another projector. How long before you will start?
Oh, look, I think it's supposed to be 3:15.
Yes.
Okay, no
My
problem.
stuff was on the chair. Which of my stuff?
Is it over here?
Here. Sorry. No, I got the papers. Oh, it's there. Don't move my stuff. At the end of 3 days.
Oh, you can take all those too. All those pads too.
Yeah?
So it's just.
PowerPoints. Yep,
Yeah.
It should be in this computer. Let me make sure the computer is up. All right, now I'm seeing a blank screen and I don't know why.
Uh-huh.
There it is. Look at that. You know PowerPoint. Can you back out? All right. How's that look for you? And what I was showing the other gentleman is once you're set, there's a stalcer right here. You just close this. Everything stays on except you don't see the blinding light. When you're ready, you just open this up and you have it. Good luck. If you have any needs or questions, you know where to find us.
I think I know somebody who knows.
Know somebody? Excellent.
Appreciate it.
Is this somebody's?